What is evil? Yeah, you were probably expecting that joke. I wanted to get it out of the way early. But what evil is kind of a hard question, right? I'm sure something pops into your head when I ask what evil is, right? Like some horrible act. But I'm wondering more about the driving force of the act, the impulse of the act, if you will, right? Because we are, of course, writers, even though we are just writing for our friends in a tabletop setting. So categorizing actions is not really as useful to us as defining the motivation for those actions. And that's what this video is going to be about, is defining the motivation of evil in your world, right? Because one could argue, right? I could argue that evil is malicious motivation. And it's the source of that motivation that defines the evil in our world, like what we think of as evil in our world, what the people of that world consider to be evil. This is something that's kind of difficult to define in the abstract, but is easy to define in the specific, right? That specific being a book or a movie or a short story maybe you wrote yourself. In the never-ending... The never-ending story. Oh, God. In the never-ending story, evil is the nothing, right? It's a force that robs people of their hopes and dreams. In media like The Witcher, evil is, well, it's evil.
Evil is evil.
Yes, thank you. Very, very useful, Geralt. In this video, we're going to talk about two types of evil and the benefits of using one over the other in our tabletop setting, what it means for how we create villains, how we create even encounters, and what we're trying to say in that world if we're trying to say anything. Because defining our intention for how evil exists in our world, in our tabletop setting, really helps develop the ethical foundation of our world and defines the relationship between our players and between our villain. Or if you're running a evil campaign, between our players and between the heroes. And this video will also aid me in some other script ideas I have. I think defining some thoughts I have here will help me explain things in the future. So that's another reason I'm doing it, and because it's my channel, I can do whatever I want. In Dungeons & Dragons, and really a lot of fantasy, we get the first type of evil, which is this idea of this immutable evil, right? Evil as a law of nature. There are gods that are good, there are gods that are evil, and there are those that follow the good god, and there are those that follow the bad god. And this is what I would call natural evil, right? Like evil exists as a moving force in the world. This is the dark side of the force in Star Wars. It exists as a universal force or a universal god, an omnipresent god. And there is an assumption that the people, the beings, are naturally good. Often there's an assumption that the people are naturally good and that they have been corrupted by this outside force, right? It's like this infestation in the world, and it is this constant battle against this infestation, and maybe your players might end that constant battle with defeating that god that is corrupting people. And in the real world, I think this line of thinking is very dangerous, and I think a lot of you would probably agree with me, and I think it causes more problems than it solves. But in a tabletop setting, it can make it really easy for us and our players because we will always know what's right? Like, we don't really have to think about what's right and what's wrong. We will always have bad guys to fight. There will always be stormtroopers. I think I just spit at the camera. There will always be stormtroopers running down the hallway, and we will always be able to shoot our blasters at them without much concern for whether they have like a family or whatever, right? Because they're part of the dark side of the Force. We just get to fight. We are part of a war that exists beyond time and space. And now you're understanding why this idea is kind of a problem in the real world. But fighting is a big reason of why we're at the table. So this omnipresent good versus evil, this evil as a law of nature, is useful as an omnipresent force. It can be more fun if you're wanting like lots of action with not very much downtime thinking about the consequences of that action. But it often feels a little bit like a lie, right? Like extraordinary atrocities have been committed in the name of an omnipresent good versus a omnipresent evil. And playing this, it can feel like we are kind of partaking in that lie. Like things can just feel a little too simplistic and a little bit unbelievable in that way, right? This idea of evil being a natural force in the world is extremely dangerous in the real world, but it does make things easy for us as dungeon masters. The second definition of evil is what I would call the perceptual evil. This is evil as it is seen through a group or culture's eyes, right? The evil itself, the source of the actions, the motivations of the evil actions is kind of just impulses of the culturally unacceptable. And I want to be clear when I'm saying a culture, I'm not using it in the wide, often national sense. We hear it in our day to day. I'm talking about like norms and rules and aspects of a group that define that group, especially the ethical aspects of that group, right? How they define their ethics. Like Dungeons and Dragons has its own culture. The people that play it have made their own culture, and to an extent, written that I guess it hasn't really been written, but they've developed an unwritten ethical code. We've developed an unwritten ethical code. There are lines that a lot of us assume to already be drawn when we get into a game, and if you don't know where those lines are, go visit RPG Horror Stories. This is not that video. But what do I mean by the impulse of the culturally unacceptable, right? Like that's kind of a weird definition. Well, it's the motivating factor of actions that are deemed unacceptable by a culture, right? So an example, if I were to say that it is evil to take another person's life without exception, that this is an evil act. Some of you would agree and some of you would not agree, and you would probably be appalled by the other side based off of the side that you are on, right? Depending on your ideologies, depending on the perception you've adopted from the culture that you have existed within your whole life, or maybe just become a part of. The pacifists of us would agree that yes, it is evil to take another person's life without exception, right? Taking another's life is an evil act. But in most cultures, there are exceptions for taking another person's life. There are exceptions that allow violent acts for, quote, like good causes or the betterment of the group, right? To protect another, to protect oneself. If you are assailed by bandits, it is culturally, morally acceptable to defend yourself with lethal force. Lethal force. This is what I mean by my definition of a perceptual evil. It is evil defined by opinion. It is what people perceive as evil because of the culture they exist within. Within a pacifist culture, seeing the impulse to commit violence, to commit violent acts, is evil. Like that's a source of evil, right? Because violent acts are unacceptable. Within other cultures, that impulse is bound by further cultural acceptances, and how individuals react to that impulse defines whether or not the culture they exist within sees them as an evil individual, sees the person committing the act as an evil individual. It's all about perception. Okay, hopefully you are following along. We have natural evil and we have perceptual evil as two sources of evil, two methods of writing evil in our world, two methods of writing evil with ethical considerations in our world, right? And while there are definitely other ways of viewing what evil is or what it could be or is not or could not be, I think these are the big two. And for me, identifying what kind of evil I want in the world, what kind of evil people in my world see as evil, it kind of helps me better understand and then better construct my villains. So let's talk about villains for a second. Natural evil, it has a tendency to create villains that are like corruptors, right? Like these villains are compared to viruses. They are often accompanied by a darkness that spreads them across the landscape. They have a supernatural force behind them. It creates easily definable lines, easy decisions. It allows for quick creation. If you're creating like villain lieutenants, little lower level bads. It allows for them to be created very quickly because their motivation is that they have been corrupted by this evil force that exists in society. And the thing about natural evil in fiction is it is often unexpectedly used as a analogy for like something, some wider issue within the real world, right? Like authors love to create a omnipresent force of evil in the world, and it's representative of like human arrogance or like the hubris of man or something, right? Like villains get to be very representative of something that is often universally bad, and so they have this well-defined structure. Or at least it's something that the writer thinks is universally bad, right? And then heroes develop that are oftentimes more classically heroic than stories that are perceptually evil. The hero simply wins for the side of good because it is the side of good. The heroic traits are like loyalty and devotion and they win for the side of good because they never stopped believing, except for that one part in Act 2 to prove to us that they're human, right? But aside from that, they've always believed, like, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about when I'm talking about, like, classical heroes. And so players get to play out that kind of classical heroism when there is an omnipresent force of evil in the world. I say classically heroic because I think there's a growing part of fiction that really has always been there, that really, like, defines heroism within looser ethical codes, if it defines heroism at all. And I think this is what we see in stories that are perceptually evil, right? Stories that are based off of the perceptions of the cultures within them. We see heroes that are making decisions within those looser ethical codes. They're going against cultures and sometimes questioning whether what they're doing is a good act, and they're pulled in different directions by the different cultures, the different ideologies of the story. There's more back and forth based on their personal beliefs rather than decisions that are just made towards an omnipresent evil. There's much more of a focus on like their own internal morality rather than the adoption of a natural good. And this is one of the benefits of perceptual evil. The players get more moral dilemmas, they get to carve their own ethical path in the world, and they get to see the consequences of the carving of that ethical path. Decisions are much harder. The determination of, quote, who is like good and bad is part of the gameplay itself. This is what it seems like creators are getting towards when they talk about making villains that are like somewhat agreeable or like likable, or players with ideologies that, villains with ideologies that the players can like almost sort of agree with, but they don't know if they should agree with them. I see that in a lot of content creators. They say like, oh, well, you should make a villain where the players at least agree with them partially. And it's like, well, how do you do that? Like, it's a pretty difficult task. I think looking at our world and defining it in a perceptually evil way where we have lots of cultures, we have lots of intermingling of different ethical codes, makes it easier to do that. And so that is the type of villain we get when we do or when we have a world with this more perceptual evil aspect. We get villains who allow the players an opportunity to just empathize with them a little bit. And some of you might be thinking of examples like Darth Vader or something when he takes his helmet off and he has that moment with Luke. Like, that's empathy, right? Like, that begins in the black and white. That begins in a natural evil world. But that's not really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about characters that empathize with villains. I'm talking about villains whose core ideologies are on some level acceptable by those fighting against them, because the definition of what makes them evil does not come from a natural law. It does not come from an omnipresent force, but rather a cultural perception. It's much easier for heroes to question a cultural perception than it is to question something that you have put a pin in and defined as an omnipresent bad, right? So those are kind of the benefits of villains in the natural evil world and villains in the perceptual evil world. Villains in the natural evil world are well defined with strong outlines, and they get to fight against the players, very like passionately, whereas villains in the perceptual evil world have looser outlines, and the quest and the heroes might kind of empathize with their ideologies at some point. Like, is saving the life of your wife an evil act? Is attempting to save your wife's life an evil act? No, of course not, right? But this is what Mr. Freeze wants. This is his goal. But he uses methods that are perceptually evil. The methods he uses, it will depend on your ideologies whether or not you think what he's doing is evil, right? Like some groups would say that the stealing of supplies and scientific equipment from warehouses is evil, right? Like that has a economic impact. That has an economic impact potentially on the workers of the warehouse who might get fired because they allowed Mr. Freeze to steal something. They have that perspective, while others would argue that Mr. Freeze is simply fighting against the abandonment of a terminally ill woman by a larger society, that he is and of himself part of a victim. They might empathize with his plight. Part of you wants to see him save his wife, but another part of you is asking, like, well, where is the line in this? Like, where is the point where this becomes culturally unacceptable? And if you are a player, you get to decide where that line is, which can be fun, but can also be sometimes a little tedious. Anakin Skywalker wants the same thing as Mr. Freeze. He wants to save his loved one. I think he has a vision of Padme dying at some point, but not in the movies. Thanks, George Lucas. That makes sense. But in this naturally evil world, it is his corruption by the dark side that makes him evil, not how he is really perceived by a group, even though he says things like this.
From my point of view, the Jedi are evil.
But the world itself is defined by an omnipresent force. Like, you clearly see when he becomes Darth Vader, and he is corrupted by the bad side, the dark side. So hopefully this gets you thinking about the condition of evil in your world, how you want to use it. This will be part of a longer series on evil in fiction and ethics and morals within tabletop worlds. So if you like what I'm talking about, if it sounds interesting, if it helps you in your game, please stick around. My name is Wes. This is Prismo, and this channel is TabletopWriter, where I look at methods of writing through the lens of tabletop gaming. See you next time. Lethal?